And a lot of what we do in the first few classes is talk about what is possible for our lives. And Brian, I'm teaching kids 19, 20 years old, who at the very precipice of their path for their careers, their professional careers, are already beginning to decide what isn't possible before they even attempt to make it possible. Because they're afraid that they're not good enough, smart enough, talented enough, networked enough, have enough money, have enough beauty, whatever it is. They're already deciding what's impossible before it's even possible. Hi, I'm Debbie Millman. I'm a designer, an author, an educator, and host of the podcast Design Matters, and you're watching Behind the Brand with Brian Elliott.
Hey everyone, I'm Brian Elliott. Welcome to another episode of Behind the Brand. Debbie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here.
I usually ask my guests, how did you get this job?
Well, it depends on which job you're asking me about, because I kind of juggle several, and I've always been that way. Even since I was a little girl, I always like to dabble in a lot of different things. I started my podcast in 2005 after a serendipitous cold call. I started my tenure at the School of Visual Arts when Steve Heller called me out of the blue and asked me if I'd be interested in starting a master's program in branding. I started my work at print magazine through a accidental meeting with the editor-in-chief on an airplane. So it's really quite serendipitous, all of it, I would say.
Well, I would love to unpack all that. Let's go back in the chronology to young Debbie. I heard sort of anecdotally a story about you when you were 8 years old and you sort of forecasted your future unknowingly. But what were you thinking about when you were a little girl?
Well, I think when I was a little girl, without quite being able to necessarily name that at the time, I was thinking about survival. I had a really turbulent upbringing, a lot of violence and vitriol. And so when I was a little girl, I was trying to navigate figuring out how to be loved, figuring out how to be safe, and probably more from an ancillary perspective, how to be able to be creative, because that was something that always seemed to be a lead gene in my heart.
I know you've been vocal about some of the trauma that you have experienced. To me, it's obvious because I've had, there's big T, there's little t. I probably have little t in my life, trauma.
It's all T.
Yeah. So I can not only empathize, but understand why you talk about it. But maybe for the audience who might be wondering more or not heard about your story, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Why you talk about it, why you think it's important for people to know?
Well, I've only been talking about it for the last couple of years, and even how I got to talking about it is I think a big part of my recovery and healing and all of that. But my parents got divorced when I was very young. It was a very acrimonious split, and that, a lot of people go through that, and nobody needs to feel sorry for me. But my mother ended up getting remarried to somebody who was extremely abusive, so emotionally, psychologically, and sexually, and physically. So there was a lot of different kinds of abuse, and that went on for quite a long time, from the time I was in 5th grade until the time I was in 8th grade. And so
I'm so sorry.
It was really tough. I wasn't allowed to tell anybody because I was threatened with retribution, in that if I told anyone, my stepfather would kill my mother and my brother. And I believed him. I didn't know that this was in the 70s, and nobody was talking about this. Nobody was talking about prevention or telling someone.
Well, but still, at that age, of course you would believe him. Of course.
Yeah, but I also, Brian, what I didn't know at the time was how prevalent it was. At the time, nobody had ever talked to me about it. And I thought I was the only person in the world it was happening to.
Yes.
And it wasn't until I think in 7th grade, we lived on Long Island at the time, and we got Newsday, not New York Newsday, Long Island Newsday. And I loved to read the comics and Ann Landers. And there was a Dear Ann Landers letter about this happening to someone else. And I cut it out and put it under my mattress because I thought, I'm not alone. I still didn't feel safe enough to tell anybody, but just the idea that I wasn't the only person in the world this was happening to was revelatory to me.
Yeah. And so I'm right there with you. I think, well, number one, I can relate to the feeling of not wanting to talk about it or detaching or isolating.
All of the above.
Because fear of the unknown, but also fear of retribution or even shame.
Judgment.
Right, what is this going to mean? But it's ironic that it's the absolute opposite of what we ought to be doing.
Yeah.
Right, we need to get all of that out. People need to know. I've been talking to a lot of my guests about mental health and how important it is to just get rid of stigmas and be okay with not being okay all the time. Like, it's just part of the human condition, right?
Absolutely.
Like, we have good days and bad days, and it's perfectly normal, you know, and we all go through some sort of trauma in our lives, and that's also normal. Let's normalize not being okay and shit happening to us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I'm so glad that you are vocal about it and talking about it. I think it's important for a lot of people to know. Somehow you were able to survive, so you must be very resilient.
I think I am, yeah. I talk about it a lot now because people ask me, you know, how did you sort of keep on going through not only that experience, but subsequent experiences that were also difficult, and then a lot of professional obstacles in my 20s and into my 30s, which tend to happen when you've experienced a lot of trauma. And ultimately what I've decided is that I think at the end of the day, I have one notch more hope than I do shame about what's possible for my life.
Yeah. Well, the other thing the myth I want to bust here is that people, you know, in my opinion, you're sort of at the pinnacle of your career. I mean, you're still trending upwards, but like you've done so much. You know, Fast Company magazine names you one of the most creative people in the world. High praise.
Surreal.
And so, you know, if you're an onlooker, let's say, you know, and I think age doesn't matter, you know, you're 18 just coming out of school, or you're middle age and you're like, I haven't found my there. You might misjudge Debbie Millman and say, man, I wish, you know, I could be her and do her path. But your path was not like this direct route. Talk about rejection a little bit. You know, tie it into this resiliency, because I think, you know, a lot of people watch the show, they're entrepreneurs. Or they're working for the man, not literally, but, you know, they're working for someone else, building someone else's empire,
right,
secretly hoping to eventually do their own thing. And so I think some of these qualities of resilience or being able to overcome rejection are so important. Because too many people, I'm afraid, don't ever try. Talk about rejection.
I agree with you. I teach, in addition to running the master's program in branding at the School of Visual Arts, for the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, 16 years, I've been teaching an undergraduate class for seniors in the business of design. And a lot of what we do in the first few classes is talk about what is possible for our lives. And Brian, I'm teaching kids 19, 20 years old, who at the very precipice of their path for their careers, their professional careers, are already beginning to decide what isn't possible before they even attempt to make it possible, because they're afraid that they're not good enough, smart enough, talented enough, networked enough, have enough money, have enough beauty, whatever it is. They're already deciding what's impossible before it's even possible. And I did the same thing. I was already sort of beginning to think, well, what can I do to ensure my physical safety? What can I do to ensure my financial security? Not what can I do to fulfill my wildest dreams.
So let me ask Why do you think they are doing that?
Honestly, I think it comes a lot from the reptilian brain. Initially, I thought, well, maybe it's about not really good parenting, but I don't necessarily think that that's what it is. I mean, I think that could be a component, and I have seen what really good parenting does for young people and how they do have a sense that almost anything is possible. However, I think that we're pre-wired. Our DNA is such that we resist uncertainty. We don't want to be in a position where we can't accurately predict what happens next. Yeah. And because of that chemistry that we have in our brains, we tend to shy away from anything that would make us feel vulnerable. Yeah. And as a result, we then begin to edit what is possible because of that fear of stepping into the unknown. And the conundrum here is that you can't do anything that has any kind of risk without being at least mildly willing to encounter the unknown.
Yeah, yeah. Seth Godin is not only become a great friend, he's probably like a surrogate father to me. And some of the best fatherly advice he's given me is this idea that Yoda was wrong, you know, from Star Wars. I know you have some Star Wars history, so I'll use that reference. You know, he said, do or do not, there is no try. And Seth said, Yoda is wrong. There is a try, there has to be a try, because either, you know, you are trying and failing and then figuring out and then eventually succeeding, or you're just hiding and or you're lying about it, right? Like you have to give it a try. You can't just jump in and be successful. You have to, you know, get your hands dirty. You got to get your feet wet, whatever that metaphor is. And that experimentation is so important. Even, I had this conversation with my son, who's 13, and he said, you know, I can't. And I was like, okay, whoa, how do you know? Like, are you predicting the future? Can you see the future that I don't know about? Please tell me, enlighten me, because I would love to know. He said, no. I said, okay, well, you have to try, and perhaps you'll fail, but like I said, we don't live in a world, especially in this house, where, you know, like, there can't be any failure. Like, I fail and make mistakes all the time. So I want you to make mistakes. I don't want you to like jump off the roof and see if you will or won't break your leg mistake. Right. Let's not do that. But like the other stuff that's not gonna, you know, be life-threatening, let's go ahead and do it. Right? And this is this idea of stepping out there.
Yeah, it's stepping into the unknown. And I have come to define confidence as simply the successful repetition of any endeavor. You know, people are like, I'll do that when I feel better about myself or when I feel more confident. Well, you're not going to feel more confident doing something in a year without trying it first, because it's that experimental repetition that gives you the sense that, oh, I can predict based on my previous attempts that I'll either be slightly better or have a much better chance of actually accomplishing whatever it is I try to do. But humans aren't born knowing how to really do anything that isn't controlled by the reptilian brain. All of our involuntary behavior is controlled by the reptilian brain. Yeah. So we have to actually experiment with walking, with the way we go to the bathroom, with talking, with eating. Everything that we do has to be learned through experimentation and repetition. Yeah. And it's only then that we feel confident. You know, we have car confidence if we can drive. We have walking confidence if we're able-bodied and can walk. Those are things we just take for granted because we've learned over time how to do them.
Relationship confidence, you know,
trust. That's what trust is.
Yeah, I mean, how many people that I have to walk up on and ask out and get rejected? Right. Or I had so many no's to get through. Oh, yeah. It's like, poof, poof, you know, and then finally you get the yes, and it's like, okay, this is not as hard as I thought it was. Yeah. Maybe it was, but that's what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Calluses.
Mm-hmm. I think that ultimately confidence is trust in the ability to do it.
Yeah. And so let's pit those again together, this courage versus confidence.
Well, this is something I really learned from Dani Shapiro, the writer. She talked about after one of our interviews that confidence was overrated. And I was like, what? I think confidence is the holy grail. And she was like, well, I think what's more important is courage, stepping into that fear of doing something for the first time or doing something without a predictable outcome. Yeah. And then from there, I started to really think about, well, what does confidence mean? What is the definition of confidence? And that's when I ultimately arrived at this sort of sense of the successful repetition of any endeavor. And now trust that it can happen and it won't kill you.
It's so subtle, but I think the order of operations is so important that we do get it backwards all the time. Yeah. We think we ought to be confident before we're courageous.
It only comes after.
It's chicken and the egg. You have to have the courage first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to be willing, to take a punch, get knocked down, but then be able to get back up.
Yeah. I don't think it's possible to do anything without doing it poorly at first. There's so few people that, unless you're a prodigy. Yeah. And, how many times a century do we get those?
Yeah, you're right. You can think about, even probably the Elon Musk and the Mark Zuckerberg, who's got, a multi-billion-dollar website, and Tesla now valued. Those people didn't get it right first.
No, and when I think about prodigy, I'm thinking really more about like Beethoven and Mozart. Yeah.
Let's go back to rejection, because you didn't get your dream job right out of the gate.
No.
And it sort of became a pattern for you to get rejected. Yeah. Talk about that and what you learned.
Well, I learned rejection won't kill you. One of my students I once asked him, what's the worst that could happen if you don't get what you want when you're trying for it for, the first time? And he said, well, I might die of heartbreak. I'm like, no, you don't die of heartbreak. You can metabolize heartbreak. You can metabolize grief. What you can't metabolize is regret. That's the thing you can't metabolize. But I just kept I was rejected at Vanity Fair. I had applied and, got through the gates and was actually being considered for a position and met with HR and ultimately didn't get the job. I was rejected from graduate school at the Columbia School of Journalism, where I really wanted to go. I was rejected from the Whitney Independent art program, which I really wanted to take. And I still get rejected to this day. I don't get accepted at everything I want to do. And sometimes rejection just comes in the form of no response. I'll write to people about being on my podcast, and I won't hear back. It'll be crickets. For me, that is a rejection because they don't care enough to say no. No's are hard too, but in some ways, no response is worse.
I totally agree. And my mind is racing a little bit on this idea of rejection, because it's a trigger for me. And it's because of my past. I have, some of that. I have some abandonment issues. My mom was married 3 times before I was like 16.
Oh my God.
I didn't have a dad growing up. I got shuffled from house to house. So I have that baggage I still carry around. And I recognize it now as an adult, as a parent. And I think, why am I taking this rejection so hard? And I think, it's got traces of it from the past.
Yeah.
And it's a distortion, right? Like it's a big deal, but it's not as big a deal as I feel it is in the moment. Sometimes it really stings. Mm-hmm. And sometimes because it's true. Like, oh, maybe I'm not as good as I think I am, right? How do you decide when to move on or when to sort of go back? Maybe the guest says no to you in 2021, and then you go back to her, and in 2022, it's a whole different, landscape. How do you decide, like, you're dead to me, or...
I'm a Scorpio.
Do you hold grudges?
I try not to, but I am a Scorpio. It's a little bit hard for me to let go of some of the sense of betrayal I might feel about certain things, but I try. As I get older, it becomes easier to just say, whatever. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah.
So maybe you can relate to this, since you interview amazing people on your podcast, and I have the same privilege. I feel like I've learned, I have these key lessons, even top of mind, for each person that I've met, and I've done like maybe 500 of these now. I interviewed Rainn Wilson, who played the character Dwight on The Office, one of my favorite shows. I don't know if you've seen it, but he was this really funny character. And when we sat down, I talked about grudges, and he was an actor, and he got rejected, and he said to me, because I confessed that I do hold grudges, and he said, well, you know, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Right. That's beautiful.
And I was just like,
that's really, really good.
You're right.
Yeah.
But it's still hard.
Yeah.
I feel like I give people second chances because I've learned that no is usually a no for now. Mm-hmm. And it's usually not about me, although I'm open to that possibility. Oh, yeah. But it's usually like, I'm too busy, I don't see the value in it, I've got other things going, other commitments, right? So, but, you know, the knee-jerk reaction is, it's got to be me.
Yeah, I always think that everything is my fault. Sometimes if I'm watching a sports game on television and the team is losing, I feel like, let me leave the room because maybe they'll do better.
Oh, so
if I have that kind of, you know, that's high narcissism. But yes, I always feel like it's my fault if things go wrong.
Another Office reference is, you know, I'm not superstitious, I'm just a little stitious. Do you know that line?
It's like being Jewish or Jewish. Yeah. I'm Jewish.
And I'm Jewish. My dad's Jewish. I asked the rabbi, so Rabbi, how should I identify? Because I feel my Jewish roots. My dad's Jewish from the beginning of time. My mom is, you know, from Scotland, not Jewish. And he said, you're not Jewish. I said, oh, okay. I feel, you know, like I identify with that half. And then I talked to all my friends and they're like, oh, come on, you know, like, so.
Absolutely.
I feel that.
I feel the kindred spirit for sure.
So staying on rejection then, so how do we push through not holding grudges? How do we know when to, you know, cut bait, move forward, or stick with it? Like, oh, they just don't understand me yet. They don't know how great I am yet.
Isn't it interesting because I think we both experience feeling like, well, feeling when we're rejected that they might not understand how great we are, but then also experiencing tremendous self-loathing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to sort of hold those things at the same time. And I'm making an assumption that you feel that way too, but I'm feeling such a connection.
I do.
In the way that we respond to very similar things, similarly, that we share that. I tend to feel very deeply about something that's happening when it happens. Mm-hmm. So if I'm rejected in the moment, I will likely cry. I will likely feel really, really bad for a few hours. But I find that if I allow myself to feel it and truly embody the experience, it tends to metabolize. And then I don't hold on to it. It's when I pretend that it doesn't bother me that it tends to stick around for years.
Ah, interesting. I've learned that too. It's something I learned from Dr. David Burns, who's one of the pioneers in cognitive behavioral therapy. He said, you have to sit with your feelings. And I was like, you're right. I tend to compartmentalize my feelings.
Right.
Tuck them away, shove them under the carpet, because they're unpleasant.
Yeah, and also men aren't really allowed to be as emotional.
Yeah, but I wear my feelings right on this. I mean, if I'm pissed or sad, it's like, and I have this resting bitch face too. That
you do?
Just generally speaking, where I get asked all the time, are you okay? And I say, oh, no, I'm just in my head, thinking about how terrible I am. No.
Absolutely, I do the same thing, but I tend to wear my feelings on my sleeve, and this has come later in life. I used to harbor a lot more anger in certain situations, and I actually feel like anger is just unmetabolized grief, and that the more you allow yourself to experience your sadness or your sense of frustration or unhappiness, the more likely you are to be able to manage through it in a healthier way.
Yeah, I would totally co-sign that. I would also add that the anger for me is unreconciled fear.
Yes.
Of like, uh-oh, I'm middle-aged now and I haven't made it in my mind. How much longer is this going to take? right? Or when is this going to happen for me? Or the rent is due.
Right.
Shit, I need you to say yes, client. Don't you know I have bills to pay? Can't you do things on my timeline, not on yours? Yeah, yeah. Very relatable. This show is called Behind the Brand. We talk about brands and branding a lot. You are one of the foremost branding experts. You've been there, done it all with big brands. Here we are in this amazingly designed home. Well, first, talk about this house. What are your impressions when you walk in here from a design standpoint? Because I know you talk a lot about people designing their lives. If you're in a position to design the space that you live in, it's amazing. Talk about your impressions.
Well, the light is spectacular. The air is just transcendent. It's beautiful here. It's just peaceful and quiet and just perfect, perfectly designed.
What kind of person can you imagine living here?
Somebody very wealthy.
Beyond the obvious.
Somebody with great taste, somebody that clearly needs and wants a lot of light. You know, I'm only sort of seeing one floor, but I love the texture of the materials. I love the colors of the materials. They really sort of speak to me. The grays, the beiges, I love that kind of earthy, nearly sort of monotone expression. So this is a house that I could very easily enjoy being in for a long time.
You know, everything I know and understand about design is that it's got to be deliberate.
Yes.
Right?
Well, it doesn't have to be deliberate. It tends to be a little bit better when it's deliberate. You know, we design everything, whether we're conscious of it or not. Every experience, every way in which we move through the world has some intention because we're conscious. Even if we're unconscious of it, we're still doing it. Yeah. And that's sort of the interesting thing about design. And so I think that it's important for people to understand that they can feel like they're designing something without necessarily being a designer.
Oh, I like that.
You know, people are always asking me, well, if design is intention, is everybody a designer? Well, that's the wonderful thing about design. We're constantly making choices. You know, design is a very human behavior. And it doesn't mean that you're a designer with a capital D, but it certainly means that you are living through the process of designing. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a working definition for brand or what a brand is?
Manufactured meaning.
Unpack that a little bit more.
Well, branding is the idea of creating a way of communication about an entity. It's a construct. Everything that we brand is a construct. And so we tend to use symbols, colors, letters, words, shapes to be able to imbue something with certain attributes or affiliations that then allow other people to create consensus around what that meaning is. Now, when I say manufactured, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just that it's created in a way to signify meaning.
It's deliberate. That's kind of where my mind was.
Deliberate differentiation, absolutely. Yeah. Design is deliberate differentiation, one thing from another. And branding is the manufacturing of that meaning.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that McDonald's uses the colors red and yellow. That's deliberate, right? I've read stories about, you know, red being, getting you high energy, maybe getting
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the category. A lot of fast food uses red.
Maybe I should have said Burger King.
Well, Burger King now uses the red and the gold, and they're eliminating the blue. But the blue at the time, when I worked on it, it was very of the moment, and it lasted for 2 decades. So, there's nothing shabby about that. That's actually pretty extraordinary in this day and age.
Do you do a lot of color theory? Like, do you subscribe to this idea that, color has an impact on our psychology?
Well, it absolutely has an impact on our psychology, but a lot of it is very socialized. So what might mean virginal in one, white might mean virginal in one culture, but it might mean funereal in another.
Yeah, or peace.
Right. So it's very much a socialized understanding. But I'm not a color theorist. I just know enough about color to be able to make sense of it in the world of branding, not necessarily from a more higher altitude anthropological perspective.
But I totally see your point, and I feel like I hear what you're saying, which is that it's situational, contextual. So if you're designing, if you're rebranding Burger King logo, that's, one mindset or situation versus maybe a consumer packaged goods for a big movie or something, or even a house.
Very, very different. I mean, if you think about red, it might mean high energy, but then other categories like analgesics, it could signify pain. So it really depends on the context and what's around it. But back in '99, when we were redesigning the Burger King identity, we very intentionally added the blue disc device to it to begin to differentiate it from Wendy's and In-N-Out and hundreds of other red and gold fast food companies around the world, including McDonald's. Now, 20 plus years later, it's eliminating it to try to harken back to its warmer, earthier roots. So.
Let's stay on logos for a second, and let's be clear that your logo is not your brand.
No.
It's a, it's a mark.
It's a representation.
Yeah. What are some of the brands that are getting design right, and maybe some that are off track a little bit in your mind? Well,
I'm not going to say whether it's on track or right or wrong, because there's so many different factors in that. What I will say is that what excites me most about the direction that branding is going is how it's becoming reappropriated by the people for the people. And what I mean by that is I think that the most significant, most illuminating, engaging brands right now are brands that are helping change behavior and brands that are helping to signify what people believe as opposed to what people want to literally buy. So there's a very different context about what's happening now. Things like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and yes, they're more than brands, but they use the very tenets of branding that Coca-Cola uses and that we used 10,000 years ago when we first began creating marks to signify what we believed in terms of religion. So I think all of the behavior is very, very similar. How it ends up represented in culture is very similar in terms of marks, in terms of a set of beliefs, a place where we might go to worship or we might go to purchase. So it's quite a fascinating human behavior that I think is changing in really exciting ways right now.
Yeah. Interesting. Go to purchase, go to worship, almost interchangeable words. So I've expanded the name of this show. At first we were focused on brands, but I realized really quickly that we are personal brands. Some would argue with me, I'm a human being, I'm not a brand, but I
would argue.
I'm fine with splitting that hair, but I think, by definition, if we are sort of what we put out in the world, and if branding is the sum total of the experiences people have as they come in contact with us. In other words, we have this interaction and we part, and you have this image or impression of me, who I am, on the first impression. Now if we become good friends, you get to know me deeper and better, but like that is my brand, whatever I...
See, I think I disagree. I think that's your character. I think that's your reputation. That is the big difference between what I believe is a brand and a person. A person is a living, breathing entity.
Agreed.
And has a consciousness and self-directs. Brands don't. We can own a brand, we can manage a brand, but brands are directed by the creator and the owner. And again, I believe they're manufactured, whereas humans are organic matter. And we live and breathe and change and evolve and cry and laugh and do lots of different unpredictable things. Brands tend not to do those as much. We can own them and manage them and direct them. Kim Kardashian certainly owns a lot of brands. But in terms of who she is as a person, I would think that somebody should aspire to grow and develop their reputation and their character. And that is the big difference between a brand that can't do that, because they are manufactured and they aren't living and they aren't breathing, and what humans can and should and I think aspire to be able to do.
Okay.
And I know it is in some ways splitting hairs, but to me it's a sort of important hair.
For sure, and I think to your point, brands and people have lost sight of humanity, and as soon as we become or dehumanize people, then it's easier to normalize bad behavior.
Yes.
And that's a problem. So I recognize that.
Yeah.
Let's talk to the small business owners or people who are thinking about building a brand. What advice do you have from a design standpoint? You know, like, I'm not talking about designing your logo, but like, where do I start? What is like 101, step one, like order of operations? Okay, I have this idea for a product or service. How do I start branding it?
Well, I guess I would go back to Simon Sinek and say, well, why?
Okay.
Why does the world need whatever it is you're doing?
Right.
And if you have a genuine, meaningful answer that isn't just to get rich, or it isn't just to find something to do with my time, whatever it is.
We believe.
Yeah, it needs to have a sense of meaning, a mission.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would do is really create an understanding of what it is you're offering and why. So why are you doing this? What is it going to do? What is it going to be? What is it going to give people? People are less interested now in a different form or a different flavor.
Yeah.
What they're more interested in now is, how is this product going to make a difference in my life?
I agree. Okay, so we establish the foundation. We stock the fridge with the basics. We have our mission, our vision, our values, maybe stated out loud. Here's what we believe.
And values.
Here's what we're about. Here's what we don't do.
Yep.
Then what?
Then I would, well, it depends on the category. You know, if you're looking at a restaurant, it would be very different than a political campaign or a new beverage or a new salty snack or a new fast food restaurant.
Let's take, since we're in, real estate world, the luxury world of Bel Air right now, let's take a hypothetical, okay? I'm a 21-year-old college graduate, go-getter, and I'm a new real estate agent with no track record, but I want to, live my dream. I'm all about the real estate.
So I would ask you, why are you doing it?
I am doing it because I feel fulfilled helping people live their best life, and also, home is like your home base for everything. It's like, where you put down these roots. It doesn't matter the size of your home, but like where you live, I think proximity makes a huge difference in your quality of life. I've heard you talk about New York City, and how that was like, before, like, I want to be an artist or I want to be a journalist or anything that you were thinking about, right. I want to live in New York City.
Okay, so then I would say, let's develop a mission. Maybe your mission would be, and I'm just riffing here, home is where the hearth is. Yeah. Right? So that becomes your mission, and then everything you do from there really ladders up to this higher altitude mission. So I would create a logo that might incorporate some aspects of humanity and how people want to be able to express who they are in their home. And then I would develop a way to communicate that socially. So, you'd have to use all of the tools around you to be able to get that message out. So everything that you're doing has to come back to home is where the hearth is, because you want to connect people, you want to open people's hearts via this new way that they're living in their homes. Yeah. And that's what I would communicate, and that would have to be consistent on every platform, on all of the different networks. And then I would maybe have a open house where you can open your heart in your open house, kind of a thing, and I would just go from there.
So it's really about walking your talk, or talking your walk.
But being really creative about how you want to communicate these values. So, again, I'm just thinking, riffing with you, open heart, open hearth, open house. There's lots of ways you can begin to extrapolate meaning with what you're doing if you're coming from it in a very open-hearted way.
So I'll go back to my theory about brand and ask, what's the Debbie Millman brand? If you had to describe the Debbie Millman brand, and again, maybe in your translation, it's the Debbie Millman character. Yeah,
I would say scrappy, hopeful, generous.
And so how are you living that mission? How are you living those values? Like what is the empirical evidence, right? Because we can say one thing, and I think that's the trouble that sometimes we get into. Like, we're a brand that cares about people. Like, there was a big...
If you have to say that, you're probably not doing it uniquely, because that's what everybody should be doing. That's like table stakes.
Well, there's a big, news story. I won't throw them under the bus, but, there's this co-working space, and they had tremendous success, and their founder basically, had this windfall of a payday, and then they let go like thousands of people who are out of work. And so, we're saying, we care about people, and then they do this, right? It's like the hypocrisy. So how do you walk that talk?
Well, people see through hypocrisy really fast. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the superpowers we have. People really tend to know when somebody is not telling the truth. Yeah. And so if you're not telling the truth, you will get caught out.
Are you deliberate about what you show people? Like this idea of strategic transparency? You have this, one of the original and most amazing podcasts. So you were the first, a pioneer, before podcasting was even like, what is podcasting, right? So you're deliberate about putting yourself out there, but like, how are you choosing, okay, because I can't imagine you're on every platform. You're probably, are you on Pinterest and Twitter and Snapchat and TikTok? And like, how do you decide where to be?
I just decide based on my own intuition and interest. And I probably should be on all of those things, but I just don't have the time or really the interest. I am on Instagram, which I really enjoy because it's very visual. I'm on Twitter, where I'm more political than anywhere else. And I'm not as much on Facebook, but I still have a Facebook page, and still, and I'm also on LinkedIn, but that's more for professional reasons than anything else. But I haven't spent nearly as much time and energy and effort in growing my brand, probably to my detriment, but it just feels icky. And I've had more sort of resistance to doing that than you'd think I would. It's a lot easier for me to do it for others than it is for myself. And for the first 10 years of my show's existence, my podcast's existence, I didn't have a logo. So yeah.
The cobbler's kid has no shoes, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I just also felt, at the time I started the show, it was I wanted it to be very much the antidote to what I was doing professionally. And so having something constructed and very manufactured felt very much the opposite of what I was experiencing doing the show for. Yeah. And so I finally did it. Aaron Draplin had an intervention with me on our episode where he showed me logos that he made because he felt so bereft that I didn't have a logo. But ultimately, I asked Armin Witt to then make something for me with a little illustration that Christoph Niemann had made for me, and that became the sort of ad hoc logo. Mm-hmm. But I do have to say that there's no question that I could benefit from some of my own expertise in developing my show and in developing my platform. Mm-hmm. But it's always been harder for me to do that.
Again, relatable. I think we're cut from a similar cloth there. Final words of advice, and let's talk to aspiring designers, whether you're designing your life or designing something.
Well, one thing that I like to do with my students is something that I did with Milton Glaser when he was my teacher at the School of Visual Arts, and it was an exercise that he created, which was about determining what you wanted your life to look like 5 years into the future.
Like manifesting.
Manifesting, and he asked you to think about everything from the minute you woke up till the minute you went to sleep, every aspect of your life. What did you have for breakfast in the morning? What were the sheets on your bed like? Did you have pets? Do you have a family? Do you have a job? What are you doing? Where are you living? How are you living? And I found that to be a really magical little exercise that when he stopped teaching, I asked him if I could begin to teach that exercise But he was teaching mid-career professionals that really needed to sort of reboot their creativity. I teach young professionals that are looking to start their creativity. So I asked him if I could extend it to a 10-year plan to give people more runway. Also because it took me 13 years to manifest my plan.
So what should we expect to happen once we do that?
I ask people to declare it, to share it with someone, and then put it away. See what happens.
Just like a time capsule.
A bit, yeah. And I think that care that you put into it and the declaration that you make of it has a very magical quality. And I'm not a woo-woo person, so I have to say there's that caveat. This isn't about just making magic. It is a magical exercise. Yeah, it's not about that. It's I think about letting your subconscious take over for a little bit in directing what you want to do.
I mean, we were just sitting back, you know, chopping it up, reminiscing about the good old days and all that. You know, tracking my roots, where I came from and where I'm going. But like I say, man,